So thanks guys for coming to this hard work talk. If it's your first one, really, welcome. I'm really excited that you're here. I've been excited about this series ever since we started in the fall, and I'm glad that it's continued. I'm just happy that you're here to learn something new and to sort of expand your notions for what you think of when you think about environmental sustainability. There's so many great people at this university who are working on sustainability in some form or another. And the goal here is just to expose everyone to this fascinating work and to sort of, like I said, challenge your notions as to what you think of when you think about working on sustainability problems. So before I introduce our speaker, just if you haven't already, grab some snacks. I actually have plates and napkins this time, which I don't always have, so I'm excited about that. But again, thanks for being here. And if you are in the course, raise your hand again. It might just be the two I know. Oh, okay, great. So just to get a sense. And with that, I'll introduce our speaker. So Jenna Nicholas is an MBA candidate at Stanford University. I feel like that really just scratches the surface as to what she does and what her experiences are. And I'm not going to spend too much time introducing her. Just want to sort of set the stage. Jenna also did her undergraduate degree at Stanford University, and since then she's been working, teaching, researching, doing lots of things, all in the field of impact investing. And I'm not going to try to explain that because I'm not the expert in impact investing, but I'm really excited to hear what Jenna has to say about it. So please join me in welcoming Jenna.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to all of you for being here today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have such fond memories of actually this room from my undergrad, and so it really is great to be back. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of some of my story and how I got into the space and the work we've been engaged in, and would love to make this as interactive as possible and open to any questions that you may have. So one story, just to sort of ground how I first got interested in this work, is I grew up in London, and I had spent summers in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in India, and knew that sort of development and impact more broadly was something that I wanted to dedicate my life to. And it was actually my freshman fall here, and went to a conference on campus, and two of the luminaries in the social impact space were speaking there. And I called my mother afterwards and I said, I want to be a social entrepreneur. And she said, what is that? And I said, I don't know, but that's what I want to do. And just feel so incredibly grateful to the institution that's here, and hope for so many of you that are taking advantage of all of the incredible resources that are at our disposal here. Just to name a few that played a really pivotal role in my story and trajectory. The Haas Center for Public Service had the opportunity to serve as a student board member there, and just the mentorship and support and opportunities that came through that. The BASES, the Business Association for Stanford Entrepreneurial Students, and the social enterprise competition component of that. And then a number of classes that the opportunity to take. I'm happy to talk more if that would be of interest, of just sort of the plethora of resources here, the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society as well. And it was really actually during my undergraduate times I got very interested in China, and particularly on the opportunities around philanthropy and impact investing in China, and did my thesis on that. And through that started to work with a couple of investors on some China-based projects, actually in the sustainability space. So we invested in a renewable energy fund in China, and in an organic farm, and in a solar stove company there. And it started to sort of spark interests and themes around how do we think about impact measurement. So we went out into the Tibetan plateau to see this solar stove company there, and looking at, okay, well, so how do you actually, there's a whole behavioral change element in setting up a company like this in that type of community. So how do we think about those types of things? And the founder of the fund was working with the Calvert Funds. It's based in DC, one of the pioneers in the impact investing space. They're a $15 billion mutual fund, really sort of carved out the social responsible investing industry. And so moved to DC, I was sort of split my time between DC and China after graduating, and started an impact investing consultancy. So we were working with different foundations and family offices on identifying investment opportunities in the social impact space. And one of the groups that had the opportunity to work with over the past few years is a foundation based in DC called the Wallace Global Fund. And the CEO of the Wallace Global Fund about 5 years ago now, 4 years ago, had a vision of creating a movement of foundations to divest from fossil fuels and to invest in new economy solutions. So the idea behind this was that, as some of you may know, the way that foundations are set up is they have an endowment where they're investing their endowment in a broad range of different sectors and geographies, and the primary goal of that endowment is to maximize financial return. And then the other sort of part of what foundations do is they give out money to worthy causes on an annual basis. And they have, most foundations have a remit of certain social issues that they are focused on giving to. And historically, the team that is focused on doing the investments for foundations and the team that is focused on doing the grant making are entirely different teams and don't have much correspondence with each other. But part of what's happened as a result of that is that sometimes the foundations will be making grants to healthcare organizations and to environmental organizations. And then at the same time, on the investment side, they're investing in tobacco companies and oil companies. And so a huge part of the motivation behind this movement was to say, this doesn't make any sense, right? These are tax-exempt organizations that exist to have a social mission. So the fact that the investments that foundations are making is inherently undermining the grant making that they're doing doesn't make sense. And so started off with a group of 17 foundations that committed to doing this. And the goal was to increase this. And so in collaborate, the Wallace Global Fund kind of hired us to help to build out this movement. And we went kind of literally door to door to foundations to talk to them about both the financial and the ethical and environmental reasonings as to why they should commit to, over the next 5 years, taking out these investments from the fossil fuel industry and actively investing in new economy solutions. And we now have about 170 foundations representing about $10 billion in assets under management that have committed to this process. The commitment is to do this over the next 5 years. And it's in collaboration with many other universities and faith-based endowments and sovereign wealth funds and individuals and municipalities that have also committed to this work. And as some of you may know, Stanford committed to divesting from coal a few years ago as well. So one of the things that happened, though, is I was kind of doing this work with these foundations and broadly in the impact investing space, and really kind of coming back to this work and experience in the Tibetan Plateau in China, was kind of seeing so often this disconnect between the investments that these foundations were making and the communities that they were trying to benefit. And particularly with the divest invest community, they would talk a lot about the phrase, the just transition, that some of you may have come across. So the idea being, in this process for communities that are transitioning from their dependence upon the fossil fuel industry to alternative sources of energy and employment, how do we think about job creation, right? So in this community that we're working in West Virginia, they've been reliant upon the coal industry for many years, and they've suffered thousands of job losses in the process of what's happening with the coal industry. And so how do we think about these questions and kind of what is the responsibility of the philanthropic community and the broader investment community in this process? And so really as a result of a lot of these conversations we're having with various foundations and investors, we about 1.5 to 2 years ago designed a platform called Impact Experience where we bring together investors and entrepreneurs and foundations and innovators in marginalized communities. Over the course of 3 days, there's 3 parts to it. Building trust, mapping the opportunities and challenges in a given community, and co-creating commitments and action items. So this example of this community we've been working with in southern West Virginia, we're partnered there with a health and wellness center and looking at, across a number of different areas, how can we, for example, last summer, bring funds like DBL, stands for Double Bottom Line, it's an investment fund out here that we had the privilege of investing in, that has invested in companies like Tesla and Solar City and Revolution Foods. So having them come down to take part in this work with their portfolio companies of Tesla and Revolution Foods to actually look at what could be the impact of these types of companies in these communities. And so as a result of some of this work, some of what we've seen is there's now what was Solicity, now is Tesla, is looking at, there's 300,000 acres of former coal mining land in this area, and looking at ways in which they can convert it into solar generation plants. Or Revolution Foods, that provides affordable, healthy lunches in low-income schools, is looking at how they can enter this community. And so being able to bridge some of those gaps between these great investors and great solutions to some of these communities where so often, and we've seen this, I think, particularly over the past year, there can be a disconnect in terms of both the discourse and the sense of opportunities in so many of these communities. And so a big part of the work that I'm so passionate about is really building some of those bridges. So that's a kind of high-level overview of some of the work that I've been engaged in. I'm happy to answer any questions about any aspect of that, whether it's the field more broadly or things happening at Stanford to plug into, or anything. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. And I'd love if, when people have thoughts or questions, if you'd be open to sharing a little bit about yourself, that would be great. I can also just keep talking. Yeah.
So I'm an MBA one. I'm just interested, how did you find your first 17 companies to sort of go to, and are you getting more that are interested in this sort of marrying, their investment goals with their
Yeah.
grant?
Yeah, so these first 17, these are foundations, and really it was, so the Wallace Global Fund, it's a $150 million foundation in DC, and they are really one of the first to put a stake in the ground and say, we are making this commitment, and we're going to go through this process of across our whole portfolio. So this is across every asset class, sort of thinking about how they were going to go about the process of doing this. And they actually hired a new investment, and they fired their previous investment manager because their former investment manager said, we can't do this, we don't have the expertise. Brought in a new investment manager, and we're part of a, sort of in parallel to it's called Divest Invest Philanthropy. There's another group, and it's one of a number of groups that exist, but there's a group called Tonic, and they have a 100% impact group. And they're a group of foundations, investment firms, individuals who are not necessarily focused on fossil fuels, but more broadly are focused on how do we across all of our assets think about having impact. So even whether that's in real estate, so thinking about sustainable real estate, whether that's on the direct investment side, so actively investing in socially responsible companies. So I think there's been sort of broader movement and shift in the mentality of institutions to be thinking about some of these questions. And a lot of it was the door-to-door. We would speak at conferences. So there's a number of sector-wide conferences within the impact space, at the Council on Foundations, for example, where a lot of these players are gathering. And I think one of the pivotal moments in the sort of shift from going from sort of a small group of foundations to, I think, sort of getting to the tipping point of it becoming more of a movement was having the Rockefeller Brothers Fund commit to joining the movement. And that had symbolic reasons in that the Rockefellers made their money in oil, and sort of having this sort of next generation, and many lines that the family said around, like, if John Rockefeller were alive today, that this is the decision that he would make as well. And so that legacy component, and then outside of the foundation community, having groups like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and the large insurance company AXA also taking the stances around this. We had some celebrities, and so I think sort of really from a social movement perspective, looking at what are all the different stakeholders that can play a role in that, whether it's students on university campuses, which was just, I think, immeasurably powerful from the university side, whether it's one-on-one between board trustees, amongst foundations, all of those factors I think help to play a role in building that momentum. And certainly, yes, we have new institutions that are signing up really on a weekly basis. It's exciting. But I have to say, I think there's the signing up, and then there's the implementation, right? And I think the divestment side in some ways is almost easier than the investment side. So divestment, it's a pretty clear, there's a lot of tools that have been developed. There's the Carbon Underground 200 that lists the top 200 worst of fossil fuel companies, and people can kind of give that to their financial advisors, they can sort of screen the investments from that perspective. But the challenging part is the invest side, right? In both identifying enough investment opportunities that meet both from a fiduciary perspective that can generate those financial returns as well as from the impact perspective. And there's a number of tools that have been developed. A company I've been advising in San Francisco, Ethic, they actually enable you, they have an algorithm and they enable both institutional investors and any one of us really to go on there and say, I really care about the environment and education and I really dislike human trafficking, and they will tailor an investment product aligned with your particular interests. So we're seeing more and more of these tools develop, and particularly sort of an area I'm particularly passionate about is with this next generation wealth transfer. So as we have people who are inheriting wealth or starting companies and being successful and wanting to think about what good they can do with that money, that we're seeing this shift where they're asking wealth advisors, like, I want to do something meaningful with my money. Like, how do I think about the opportunities that exist? And so we're seeing more and more financial product being created to meet that interest and demand from an increasing number of investors.
Yeah. So if I may just follow up from that, do you or who is responsible really for like measuring that impact? You know, that money that gets invested in these areas. Is there sort of a record of actually measuring the outcome, the impact?
Yeah, and so there's a few different parts. So there's the Divest Invest Philanthropy Coalition, which is 170 foundations, and now my involvement is more as an advisor than I was project manager in the past. But so we set up a process from the beginning that was set out as an annual survey, and I think they're still doing that. They might have made it quarterly now. That basically gets all of the foundations to report on what have you invested in, like how far in the process are you of divesting. Again, the commitment is to do this over the course of 5 years, because it can be challenging, at least quickly, to divest. There's a whole thing from the life cycle of funds, and so it's hard to get out at certain points in time. And so tracking where are institutions at in terms of their process of both divesting and investing, and I think more broadly from a movement building sort of educational perspective, being able to have the data on across different types of investment opportunities. So whether that's an area that in some work is around green bonds, so there's a whole area of investment opportunities that's, whether it's fixed income, it's green bonds, there's sort of guaranteed returns, but not necessarily super high returns. So there's some financial products that kind of lie more in that category, and then there's financial opportunities that are into companies like Tesla and SolarCity that kind of have this potential for large impact and large returns, and how do you think about that? And so there's this data record as such of how these institutions are going about doing that, and part of the purpose of that those surveys is both to keep the foundations accountable, but also to have this community of practice, so that particularly as people are joining the movement that are newer to this space can say, oh, this is how institutions that are similar to me have approached this is maybe how I might be able to approach it as well. And then more broadly in our work, impact measurement is a huge part of it. And more broadly in the sector, there's an organization in New York, the Global Impact Investing Network, that have developed standards called the Impact Reporting Investment Standards. And again, this is more on the direct investment side, but it's a platform to basically be able to see across each different industry and geography the types of impact measurements that are used, and there's ability to benchmark one investment against another. And then there's other standards like environmental, social, governance standards that are used. So I think the metrics component of impact investing is such a kind of pivotal moment for that. Please.
I'm Drake. I don't have any background really with this, but from what I kind of hear, you're saying like you're pushing foundations to like treat the social returns as kind of a financial return for them also in the same way.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think that part of what we're looking at is this idea that the definition of success should be not just the financial returns, but there should also be social returns. I think it's maybe less that they're synonymous, they're the same, but rather that as we, at the end of the year, in the same way that every company has to do its financial reportings of this is how much money we've made, how much money we've lost, there should be the same kind of reporting around here is the social impact we've created. And there's actually this new organization that started a few years ago called Benefit Corporations that actually make it a requirement of companies that kind of to get this status as a benefit corporation to actually do this. So they, at the end of the year, in the same way that they're reporting on their financial metrics, have to do the same thing from a social and environmental perspective. And it's really powerful. We're seeing companies, like companies that work with Ben & Jerry's that are benefit corporations, and so you'll see in their annual reports a pretty comprehensive assessment of here are our social and environmental goals, here's where we are in terms of that, and looking at that across every aspect of their work. So Ben & Jerry's, for example, on the sustainability side, have a goal of across their whole supply chain reducing their carbon emissions. And so anything from looking at what can we feed the cows differently so there's less methane that's created to what is the environmental sustainability of the buildings that we're using. So every aspect of that, having metrics to be able to assess that and to hold oneself accountable to. So that's the kind of goal as such. And as a requirement when impact investors invest into companies, reporting on these types of metrics is essential for that.
Along the same lines, do you usually recommend like a complete blacklist of a certain company, or is it kind of like a scale back proportional to like how negative the impact is socially or how positive the impact is socially?
Yeah, so our work is really, we work with each individual investor on their approach, so it could be a mixture of either of those. The divestment work certainly the divestment work around fossil fuels, and each divestment kind of movement has its own process around this, but does have a kind of blacklist as such. And the blacklist is this, it's called the Carbon Underground 200, and they actually update it on a quarterly basis based on how badly the companies are doing. And it's the top worst, 100, and it sounds funny, 100 coal companies and the top worst 100 oil companies. And that's a starting point. So a lot of the institutions that are going through the process of divesting will do much more than that, because as we know, there's fossil fuel use in many different things, and so even from an agriculture perspective, and so many are going further than that, but it's a good starting point in terms of having a tool to be able to engage. So the Ford Foundation actually just made an announcement this week that they're making $1 billion commitment to impact investing. And so for them, that will be, this blacklist will be, such a small part of the broader work that they're doing in terms of actively investing in socially responsible businesses rather than just what are they not investing in. So there's a social screen is what they call it. We're talking about divestment from fossil fuels here, but often these screens will be done around tobacco, around sometimes gambling, around weapons. So there's a broad range of different types of socially responsible screens that endowments will use as they're thinking about their investments.
I might be playing, or I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, but I've heard arguments not just from people who don't believe in climate change, but from people who just think about the economics of the way energy works and the way the energy markets work. Like there are arguments against divestment as a strategy toward moving toward clean energy technologies, because arguments being that the economic system that we've built around the way energy is produced and consumed would be severely hurt by divestment from companies like coal companies or oil companies, and that would just sort of hurt the markets for energy use. And so I'm just wondering, what's your experience in dealing with arguments against divestment as a valid strategy, and how do you think about those things?
Yeah, no, a lot. I spent 3 years doing that. Yeah, I think a few. So one of the arguments is the argument that you gave, and I think part of it is the time horizon through which we're looking at the issues, right? So I think if we're looking at this in the time horizon of the next couple of years, I think there is a valid argument in that, right? I think there is something around the and I also think if it was like the next 2 years and all money was going to be taken out today from all of those companies, then I think there's a valid argument there. I think the nature of the amount of capital that we're talking about and the longer term time horizon around actually unlocking greater pools of capital to actively invest in solutions of the future, I think is where the strength of a divest-invest strategy comes in. And I think that the important part is that we don't decouple or they separate the divestment from the investment. I think divestment in and of itself, I actually think there are more arguments against than when it's in collaboration with the investment component. And I think that's because it's this, like, what are you putting your stake in the ground for what you stand for, as opposed to just what are you standing against. I think some of the other arguments that we've heard against divestment, and is becoming increasingly less of an argument as sort of financial markets move in the way that they have, but certainly at the beginning, like before we were seeing all the challenges with certainly the coal industry, but was from a financial perspective. So going back to the case I was describing around foundation endowment, so, and actually all sort of financial institutions have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize financial returns, right? And that's the argument that everybody will come back to, is we can only do things that will help us to be able to maximize financial returns. And so if divestment is seen as something that does not help in maximizing financial returns, then it's very hard to make a case. And so I think there was actually also a shift in terms of your question earlier about how did you get all these foundations to come on board. A big part of it was actually not grounding the arguments in the ethical and environmental arguments at the beginning, certainly, but grounding them in the financial arguments, of actually saying the case that we always use around stranded assets, so the fact that we have trillions of dollars of coal on the ground, but that so much of that isn't actually burnable to be able to keep within the 2 degrees Celsius sort of temperature. And so being able to make these cases that actually, it's not like, oh, wouldn't this be nice because we care about the environment, but actually grounding that in the financial arguments for why divestment is important. So I think, and I think that shift has begun to take place. But I do also think, again, we'll come back to this, like, it's not just this blacklist, but actually having more comprehensive assessment of climate risks and opportunities within endowments is a core part of what is necessary for the success of the broader industry is thinking about these questions. Please.
Is there a drop in the profits of institutions that follow this?
Yeah, no, actually, certainly it all depends on timing, but many of the institutions that have done this have actually had an outperformance in terms of their financial return. I would say the data writ large is pretty neutral in terms of the impact, but there's just as many sort of institutions we have very short data supply because they haven't been doing this process for a long time. But there's also actually some groups that have done back data on if you had divested at different points in time, what will be the financial impact of that. And if anything, it's been a positive impact. Again, partly purely because of just what's happened within the coal industry, that there's, in many ways, the financial argument for investing in coal is much less than it would have been 20 years ago. So no, we haven't seen a decrease in that. I should say more broadly within social responsible investing, again, it's sort of balanced, but even on the sort of private equity side around investing in socially and environmentally responsible firms, Cambridge Associates actually did a report recently on this and also saw an outperformance. So I think having more and more of that data, and given that the field isn't that old, we only have a short time horizon of data, but the data that we do have actually is pretty favorable in terms of both divestment and more broadly socially responsible investment.
How would you explain that? Because it seems like if you had an unlimited number of companies to invest in, and then you limit yourself,
yeah,
seems like it would go the other way.
Totally, and that is more like modern portfolio theory is that, right? And like that is the basis of the argument that it's against fiduciary responsibility is, no matter what it is that you're eliminating from your portfolio, that you're naturally going to see a decrease in returns. But I think the more nuanced, and they're really interesting in that they, for exactly the reason that you just said, did not want to commit to divestment, right? They were like, we want to take a comprehensive approach to climate risks and opportunities. We don't want to limit any of our investment horizons. And they actually went through a pretty rigorous process of measuring and ensuring that they were meeting a certain threshold around climate risks and opportunities. But in the process of developing that system, they end up taking out all of their investments from the fossil fuel industry. So I think that no matter what way you're kind of approaching it, when we think of it just sort of the basis of, oh, by eliminating part of your portfolio, just inherently by doing that, we're going to minimize our financial returns. But the nature of it is on a daily basis, people who are making smart investments are inherently not investing in certain asset classes or in certain industries anyway. And so it's just a reshaping of how we're sort of constructing the argument as to what our investment thesis is as such, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Please.
I think like with divestment on campus, I've heard a couple of different, like I guess there's like kind of debate between two schools of thought that I'd be interested to hear your opinion on. That like one of them is like we're divesting because like as a collective movement, like we're hoping to like I guess hurt the fossil fuel industry or accelerate a transition away from the fossil fuel industry. But also I've heard the argument that like it's really not actually about the effect on these companies. It's more about making a statement and, you know, accelerating that transition just by showing people that we're excited about this and this is where we're moving towards. So I don't know where you see a lot of that work. Do you see somewhere in the middle maybe?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that and I think some data points for both. So I think the point about the influence on the industry is it's really interesting in looking at, for example, and we've seen this from Shell execs to Exxon execs who will say, not necessarily publicly, but some of them even publicly, that even if it's just a matter that the divestment movement is making this something that they have to talk about on their agenda at their board meetings. I mean, that in itself, that it's that they're having to make statements as to what is their response to this, and even if it's a slower process, or at least for the larger institutions around their actual response to it, I think the mere fact that those conversations are now happening and having to happen more regularly within these companies is part of the definition of success, right? There's sort of this mirror that's being put up as a kind of semi-accountability for these companies. I think we're also seeing at a smaller scale, so I remember vividly going to Calgary, Canada as part of this divestment work, where actually it was a fascinating situation where it was actually the children of some people who were inheriting oil companies were trying to put pressure on their parents to begin the divestment process, right? And so they asked us to kind of come in to engage around this. And you could see at this local level, this very real decision-making process that's going through of how do we actually go about doing this and how do we start to begin that literal divestment process of our own company moving forward and build off the assets that we do have to be able to do that. So I think that we are seeing that direct impact. And then I think that there is this broader sort of political impact, which has always been the purpose and the goal, and I think it's harder within the current administration, but the broader perspective of saying, if we can get what is now this $4.4 trillion in assets under management across all of the institutions that have committed to divestment, that's still a tiny sliver within the multi-trillions of dollars within the broader fossil fuel industry, but it's not insignificant. The political pressure that can come from movements like that. And we saw that. We were in Paris during the climate negotiations a couple of years ago. And we saw that there, where the conversations around divestment were part of the sort of core decision-making process at the, within the UN conversations. So, trickle effects, right? But I think in terms of your initial questions, they were both done. And what was your name?
I'm Jake. Sorry.
Cool. Please.
Hi, I'm Alex. I also have very little knowledge in this area. I was wondering how the community aspects fit in with the best side. So you talked about how Tesla we're going to West Virginia. Would you mind speaking a bit more about how that works?
Totally. And so this is really, so 2 years ago, we noticed that exactly just what I was saying. I was like, how do they fit in, right? That there wasn't really a platform for that kind of fitting in to take place, right? There are impact investing and philanthropy conferences happening on I'd say almost daily, but certainly a weekly basis in New York, DC, San Francisco, London, all the time. But the discourse and the engagement with communities like Southern West Virginia has been virtually nil. And so about 2 years ago, we designed a platform to actually begin to build those bridges. And it was building off background in doing this social responsible investing, doing this philanthropy work, and actually having this platform that's community-led. So we have, in every community that we work with, a local community partner that we work with to really start to identify what are the needs in this community and how do we curate a group of companies and investors and philanthropists that are aligned with the particular needs of that community and lead people through a process very similar to the design thinking program here of actually starting to map out the opportunities and challenges in those communities and to be able to build some of those divides. And we start actually every gathering that we have, we asked particularly about Tesla and Solar City, we start every gathering that we have with everyone sitting in a circle and everyone shares a symbol or an object that has significance to them. And so last summer when we did this, we had a former coal miner in the group and he brought a piece of coal as his object. And he talked about how the coal for him wasn't just about a job, it was about his community and his family and being American. And this woman from Solar City who spent her life as an environmental activist and fighting for environmental preservation was very emotional in this moment because she said, I believe so strongly in these causes and I've spent my whole life fighting for this, but I've never actually met a coal miner. I've never actually met somebody that this is the basis of their life. And so being able to have the starting point of this engagement come from a place of our common humanity and then building solutions and collaborations and what have you from there rather than the other way around is a huge part of the orientation and work that we're engaged in. So we've done this now in about 10 different communities and we're continuing to expand in other areas.
Thank you. How do you choose communities? Or how do you decide where to start?
Yeah, so far it's all come from referrals. Actually, our first gathering was in New Orleans, and we've done work in Anchorage, Alaska, and in Oaxaca, Mexico. And each time we have people come in from various places, and people have said, "Oh, we really want you to do this in this community or that community." And then there's a number of sort of networks. So actually, the organization that we're partnered with in West Virginia is a federally qualified healthcare clinic. And it's one of 1,000 across the country. And so there's interest from a number of other of these clinics in partnering. Cisco and Google, how do we kind of help to do this? Because Cisco came down with us as well, and they have a whole education track that they're interested in engaging. And so I think there's a sort of corporate engagement component as well as this sort of foundation investing engagement.
And maybe something else. What's in it for the corporate companies?
So for them, it's part of their core business operation. So for Tesla and Solar City, Solar City exists to spread solar around the country, right? And so being able to have a market entry strategy into a new market that they don't have relations in is very valuable to them. And similarly for Cisco, they have a whole. This is not so much on the sustainability side, but they have it was actually the education practice that was coming down with us, and they have huge goals both from a connectivity perspective. So community in West Virginia, they have no broadband access, right? And so being able to connect to leading technology companies and the market access question for Cisco, as well as partnering with the local community college and university to help to expand their work into those communities. So framing it also as this business opportunity for the investors in the companies, but doing so in a way that's not extractive, right? I think part of the need to sort of start from this common humanity and trust building is that historically the engagement, certainly an example in West Virginia with the coal industry engagement, has been one of extraction, and so needing to recalibrate around that is a huge part of what we're focusing on. thoughts or questions? Please.
Something that I just thought about when in thinking about sort of the, I don't know, maybe the more human side of this, bringing in a solar company into a place where maybe solar energy isn't so popular, like the person holding the pole. What are the sort of, in these conversations, do you run into challenges like that where like ideologies sort of come into play? Does that make sense?
Every day.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, a few things that's interesting. So actually our partner in West Virginia, who's a doctor, entrepreneur who runs this health center there, he, a couple of years ago actually, put solar panels on the roof of this health center and actually had patients who refused to then come to the clinic because he had done that, right? I mean, it's so deeply ingrained and personal, right? Where this like, just getting healthcare becomes in jeopardy as a result of that. So we see that just this visceral reaction to anything new, and that's not just solar energy, but really any other type of job creation. So we have a whole track that's focused on like tourism opportunities in the community. And I think part of the framing, and it's funny even talking about divestment, well, I very rarely talk about divestment on the ground there, because I actually think that it's framing it not as like coal is evil, coal is bad, but rather this has been the history and this is the legacy, but as we're building towards the future, what are alternative sources of income that we can be considering, right? And not framing this as like we're against this, but rather what are we for? And I think particularly recently, this whole idea of, as many of you know, that many of the people who have been laid off from the coal industry have only a high school education, but were making $80,000 to $100,000 a year, if not more. And the opportunities to make that amount of money with the education that they have and the communities they are is really difficult. And so there's an organization that we're partnering with actually called the Coalfield Development Corporation. And they're actually providing, alongside the sort of retraining work they're doing, they're providing university education to many of these former coal miners. And I think what's powerful about something like that is this opportunity to get an education, get access to new jobs, to also have those jobs be local. So I think there's a whole challenge around a lot of the discourses around like, how do we help people in these communities to leave, which might be helpful and relevant to some people, but there are so many people that want to stay where they are. And so being able to actually think about what are opportunities in the community itself, I think is really important as well. But yes, lots of challenges around that, and I think that's where the narrative part and the subtlety around the language that's used and having local leadership is just such a huge component around that. And building off local cultural assets. So it's an incredibly beautiful part of the country. They have these amazing ATV trails, and that's just not something that people think about necessarily. Some people do, and that's great, but not something that people necessarily think about when they think about southern West Virginia. And so being able to like help in packaging and branding that as part of the engagement strategy is being a huge part of it as well.
I just had a follow up. You talked about this isn't what we're against. This is what we're for, right? Just wondering if you could spend a couple of minutes specifically talking about like maybe pick a place. What types of things are like what exactly are you for? You know what I mean? Like when you go to these places and you're trying to think about things that you can invest in. You talked about tourism. Maybe it's a solar company, but like just I'd be curious to hear more specific examples.
Yeah, so those two definitely in West Virginia. Those two for sure. I think some of the other ones there's also that agriculture opportunities. So in these reforming these former coal mining lands, there's huge agriculture opportunities there. Broader, even wind power manufacturing. We had someone from the National Renewable Energy Lab come down with us last week when we were there, and she was super excited about seeing some of those opportunities. More broadly, fostering an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So, an incredibly beautiful place, but setting up a broader transportation infrastructure, broadband opportunities to actually kind of get the place on a map in a sort of deeper way. The investing work that we do more broadly, kind of outside of West Virginia in particular, also comes into microinsurance and financial inclusion education technology, and so it covers a broad range of different sectors and geographies. And a big part of what we're thinking about in each of the communities that we engage in is of the kind of portfolio companies, and we talked about a couple in for West Virginia, Revolution Foods and Tesla, but for each of the communities that we're working in, what are the particular company interventions that are relevant in those contexts, and being able to map both of those, the needs that are there, as well as some of these interventions that are most directly applicable to those communities is a lot of what we think about.
Okay, it is 8:20, so we've gone a little bit over. But thank you, Jenna, for
Thank you.
sharing some stories.